Teaching contextualization to our AP history students is about as easy as winning a cage fight with a silverback gorilla. And yet, contextualization is one of the most crucial skills our students are required to learn and perform. So how do we teach it? And if that's the question you're asking, then this video is for you. So get your boxing gloves on because we're about to go into the cage and teach that gorilla who's boss. And it's just a metaphor. I love gorillas. I don't want to hurt a gorilla, but let's just get to it. As with everything we do in our classrooms, we have to start with why we're asking our students to do this. And spoiler alert, if my answer to this question is something like, because it's on the test, then I've already lost. That answer isn't going to inspire anyone. And so in order to really help our students see that historical contextualization actually matters to their lives and isn't just another thing they have to do in a classroom that maybe they don't want to be in to begin with, I have to show them why this skill matters. Now I'm going to give you an example of how I did this in my classroom, and I doubt it's going to work in many of your classrooms, but it'll at least give you some sense of how it can be done. Now I taught in a very conservative Christian school, and it's not a stretch to say that most of the students came to my classroom with a common belief taught to them by their middle school history teachers, namely that America was founded as a Christian nation. Now, as someone who is very interested in the history of evangelicalism in America and has read widely on this count, I know that the answer to the question on whether America was founded as a Christian nation is complicated. It's certainly not a slam dunk as either a yes or a no, though I think there is probably more evidence to say no than yes, and the answer changes depending on whether you're considering social history or political history or cultural history. The one thing I do know is that the question was rarely posed in the founding of our nation. And the fact that it is such a widespread question today, especially among evangelicals, says more about present evangelicals than it does about the religious founding of the United States. But none of my students showed up with any of those nuances, but it was an answer to a question that they had been taught to be deeply invested in. Many of them were aware of contemporary politicians who ran on platforms of Christianizing America, like bringing prayer back into schools, etc. Now, my goal was not to dismantle any deeply held beliefs that they had. I only wanted them to see that the answer to the question was more complicated than these politicians made it seem. So I began by giving them an excerpt from a letter by John Adams, which was brought to my attention in John Fia's magnificent little book called Why Study History. The pseudo-historian David Barton uses this letter from Adams to prove that America was founded as a Christian nation, and the truth is, it's pretty compelling. In this letter, Adams says, there is no authority, civil or religious, there can be no legitimate government but what is administered by this Holy Ghost. Clear as day, John Adams believed that the only legitimate government is one administered by the third person of the Trinity. But that's where David Barton stops reading. He presses this conclusion upon his audiences worldwide and uses other similar documents to do so, and with no ability to think in terms of contextualization, his audiences and my students are convinced America was founded as a Christian nation. But then I give my students the rest of the letter in which we witness Adams say this: all this is artifice and cunning and the secret original of the heart, yet they all believe it so sincerely they would lay down their lives. Alas, the poor, weak, ignorant, dupe human nature. And in case they don't immediately grasp what's going on, I point out that line in there about the Holy Ghost administering government seen in the context of the whole letter is actually Adams's attempt to describe the point of view of people whom he deems poor, weak, and ignorant. In other words, the first quote is the opposite of Adams's view, the view he is actually roasting in the larger context of the letter. And so as my students are reeling about that, I tell them, listen, David Barton has a very clear reason to take this quote from Adams out of context. He runs a nonprofit whose goal is to get candidates who align with his position elected. And if you know the whole story about the founders' religious views, which is to say, if you learn to think contextually, you would not be easy prey for his coercion. And that's just one example. You don't have to look too hard to find politicians of any stripe or cable news pundits using the past very badly, stripping it bare of all nuance so that they convince unthinking people of their position. Or you could do this with any other hotly debated figures like Christopher Columbus or Abraham Lincoln. Or you can find an issue in your context that makes more sense. You just have to make sure it's an issue on which they already have an opinion, and preferably a strong opinion. But ultimately, that is what thinking contextually gives you. In a world full of people trying to deceive you for their own ends, learning to think contextually gives you the ability to think your own thoughts and act according to your own interests, not those that are thrust upon you by charlatans and fools. And when they understand that why of thinking contextually, it starts to matter to them more than simply trying to force them to learn it for a test. Now, there is a big difference between understanding that contextualization is important and actually being able to perform the skill. In the example I just gave about John Adams, that was about as basic as contextualization gets, like read what comes before and after. But what I'm establishing in that exercise is that context determines meaning, and that's the larger skill they need to learn in our class. I had a professor in grad school who was always fond of saying that a text without a context is just a pretext for whatever you want it to mean. And the same is true of a personality or an event or a document or whatever. So how do we teach this exceedingly important skill? The way I do it, first of all, is to practice with them on a topic outside the curriculum. As I mentioned in the Q&A video from last week, I put up a frame from Stranger Things and I asked them to give me the story that makes sense hints out of this frame. Someone in the comments said that they used the first part of the Fellowship of the Ring, in which Galadriel recounts the history of the Ring of Power and the battle against Sauron in the Second Age of Middle-earth. I've also used Star Wars to show them what information is necessary to understand before jumping into Leia on the ship sticking Death Star plans into R2-D2. And this helps students see that essentially what we're doing in contextualization is narrative in nature. In order to understand the story that is to come, what do I need to know here in the beginning? Now, the second thing I do is take that exercise and use it to show irrelevant context. So I put the opening crawl from A New Hope up, and most of them have seen this movie, so they know what's coming. But not as many of them have seen episodes 1 through 3, so I give them a quick synopsis and I put a few events from those movies on the board. For example, Anakin Skywalker, who would later become Darth Vader, was a pod racer as a child. And then I asked 2 questions about these events. Is it related and is it relevant? Regarding pod racing, the answer is yes, it's related, but no, it's not relevant to what you need to know in order to understand A New Hope. Do you need to know about pod racing to understand that Darth Vader is a bad guy and wants to crush the rebellion? No, it's not relevant to the story. But it is related because that is part of Anakin's backstory. So what this exercise does is demonstrates for the students that just because an event is related to another event doesn't mean it's relevant to the story at hand. And then third, over time, we begin applying these skills to historical events. When I introduce contextualization for LEQs and DBQs, I give them a prompt, they write a thesis, and then I write 7 or 8 related events on the board, and then we have the related and relevant discussion. Yes, this is related, but not relevant to the thesis. And when they've identified the ones that are relevant to their thesis, they have to justify why it is relevant. If context confers meaning, then why does this help clarify the meaning of that event? And in the beginning, as you no doubt know, that is a struggle for them, but the more they practice doing it, the better they get at sifting the related from the relevant. Okay, now I hope that helped clarify the why and at least some of the how for contextualization. Sourcing is another skill that's difficult to teach, so you can click right here to get some insight on how I do it. Also, I've got teacher resources for APUSH and AP World, so check the link in the description if you want to have a look. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.